Have you ever waited for something so long it started to feel like life had forgotten you? For George, 74 years old and living alone in a quiet town just outside Cincinnati, time had become a slow, faithful companion, both comforting and heavy. Each day moved like a soft whisper filled with small rituals. A cup of black coffee on the back porch, the distant sound of the train passing just after 10 a.m., the creak of the same floorboard by the kitchen sink. Life, for the most part, was predictable. And yet, under all that predictability, something stirred. A quiet ache, a question that never quite spoke aloud but lingered in the corners of his mind. What now? George's wife, Helen, had passed 8 years ago. Cancer. Quick, unexpected, and cruel. Her laughter had once filled their home with warmth, and her absence left a silence so loud that even the ticking of the old grandfather clock felt like a thunderclap. He had 2 grown children, kind, busy people living states away. They called, they visited during the holidays, but their lives moved in fast lanes while George remained at the quiet edge of things. One chilly autumn afternoon, George wandered into a second-hand bookstore he hadn't visited in years. Something about the smell of old paper and worn leather covers always gave him comfort. His fingers brushed along spines of forgotten titles until he pulled out a slim notebook, barely bound together. It wasn't the title that caught his attention. It had none but a sentence handwritten in faded blue ink on the first page. Everything unfolds in its own time. He stood still for a long moment, reading that line over and over. There was nothing elaborate about it, no philosophical jargon, no footnotes or verses, but something about those 6 words struck him like a quiet bell ringing in his chest. Everything unfolds in its own time. What if, George thought, he hadn't been forgotten by life at all? What if he'd simply been standing too close to the canvas to see what was being painted? That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay awake, watching the shadows dance across the ceiling. For the first time in years, he wasn't waiting for something to end. He was waiting to begin again, not in the loud, dramatic way of youth, but in the soft, mindful way of someone who had learned that rushing only leads to missing the point. This story isn't about grand adventures or miraculous transformations. It's not about escaping the reality of aging or pretending grief doesn't shape us. This is the story of George, and maybe, in some ways, the story of all of us who've lived long enough to know that healing doesn't arrive on schedule. That joy sometimes takes the long way around, and that peace isn't something we chase. It's something we begin to notice when we finally sit still. If you're someone who's also found yourself in life's quieter chapters, wondering what it all means, feeling the pull of memories, or simply hoping to feel connected again, I invite you to come along. George's story may not solve all the riddles of aging or loss, but it might help you feel a little less alone in them. And if this journey speaks to something inside you, consider subscribing. Not just to follow stories like this, but to be part of a quiet, growing space where we honor the beauty of slowing down, letting go, and trusting that in the silence, life is still unfolding. Number 1, the weight of waiting. George never imagined that waiting could feel so heavy. In the years after Helen passed, waiting became the rhythm of his life. He waited for morning sunlight to stretch across the floorboards. He waited for the kettle to whistle. He waited for the mailman, though he rarely received more than bills and catalogues. He waited for the phone to ring, for a knock at the door, for a familiar voice to break the long, quiet stretch between days. But most of all, he waited for something he couldn't quite name, a shift perhaps, or a sign that life still had something left to offer. When you lose someone who was your entire world, time does strange things. The minutes slow, not in comfort, but in a kind of dull ache. George often felt like he was standing still while the rest of the world rushed forward. His children called, but their voices were filled with stories he wasn't a part of, promotions, school recitals, weekend trips. They loved him, but love from a distance can sometimes feel like a postcard from a country you'll never visit. There was a particular Tuesday afternoon that lingered in George's memory. He had applied to volunteer at the local community center, a program for seniors to help mentor kids with reading. It wasn't much, but it had given him a flicker of purpose, a chance to be useful again. He had even ironed his old dress shirt and brought a folded resume, something he hadn't touched in over a decade. But after a brief conversation, the coordinator gently informed him that due to a recent change in policy, they were no longer accepting volunteers with certain health conditions. George, with his borderline diabetes and slower gait, didn't qualify. He smiled politely, thanked her for her time, and walked back to his car, holding the folded resume like it was something delicate that had just broken. It wasn't rejection that hurt. It was the realization that the world no longer expected anything from him. That somehow, without notice, he had slipped from participant to observer in the great theater of life. That night, he sat in the quiet glow of the kitchen, holding the old notebook he had found in the used bookstore. His fingers traced the words on the first page again. Everything unfolds in its own time. It sounded wise, reassuring even. But in that moment, it also sounded distant, like advice meant for someone younger, someone still in the middle of becoming. Still, something in him resisted giving in to despair. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the part of him that used to teach poetry to high school students and believed deeply in second meanings. He thought of all the books he had loved, the stories that never rushed to the ending. How often the best parts were buried in the middle chapters, the quiet parts most readers overlooked. Maybe this was one of those chapters. He poured himself another cup of coffee, this time not out of habit, but as a small act of reclaiming the evening. He turned to a blank page in the notebook and began to write. Not a letter, not a journal entry, just a thought. Maybe the waiting isn't a pause. Maybe it's preparation. As the ink dried, George didn't feel fixed. He didn't feel younger or lighter or more certain. But he felt for the first time in a long while that the weight of waiting had shifted slightly. That perhaps it wasn't about waiting for life to return, but learning to see that life had never truly left. It had only changed its shape. And now it was asking him to slow down, to listen, and to trust that something still waited for him too, just around the bend. No, too, learning from the river. There was a narrow footpath just beyond the neighborhood park where George liked to walk. It wasn't a place many people visited, overgrown in parts, quiet, a little forgotten, but it led to the river. And for George, that made all the difference. He had walked that path many times over the years, often with Helen beside him. They would bring a thermos of coffee and sit near the water's edge, talking or simply listening to the hush of the current as it moved along its own time. After she passed, George avoided the river for a long while. It held too much of her presence, her laughter, her stillness, the way she used to hum without realizing it. But something about that old notebook he'd found, the one with the sentence, that wouldn't leave his mind, had nudged him back. Everything unfolds in its own time. The words felt as though they belonged to the river itself. That first walk back was hesitant. His feet crunched on leaves that had fallen and dried in layers over the months. The river came into view gradually, like a memory returning. When he reached the bank, he just stood there, hands in his coat pockets, watching. The water didn't rush. It didn't struggle. It curved around rocks, slid beneath fallen branches, reflected the sky without trying to. And it kept going. No matter what blocked its path, it adapted and moved forward, never too fast, never still, just steady. George felt a strange comfort in that, as if the river was speaking a language he was only now beginning to understand. A few days later, he returned. This time he brought a small folding chair and sat quietly, watching again. That's when he noticed her. A woman, maybe a few years younger than him, sitting cross-legged on a blanket near the bend of the river. Her eyes were closed, her posture straight, her breathing slow and deliberate. She seemed completely at peace, untouched by the world's urgency. He didn't speak to her that day, but he watched the way she sat, how unbothered she seemed by time or noise or thought. There was something in her stillness that echoed what he saw in the river. When he returned the following morning, she was there again. This time, she smiled at him and gestured for him to sit nearby. They didn't speak at first. They didn't need to. The river was enough. Eventually, she introduced herself. Lee May. She had moved to town to be near her daughter, but spent her mornings by the river, in quiet meditation. "It teaches us how to live," she said simply. "See how it doesn't force, doesn't resist, and yet it always reaches where it's meant to go." George nodded slowly, those words settling into him like stones in the current. Anchoring, gentle. He didn't know much about Zen or meditation, but he knew something in him had shifted. Watching the river, he realized he had spent so much of his life swimming upstream, trying to fix, to plan, to control. But maybe it was time to learn from the water. Maybe peace wasn't found in trying to change the direction of life, but in learning how to float. Number 3, the beauty of what doesn't last. On a quiet Saturday morning, George opened the door to the shed behind his house, a place he hadn't stepped into for years. Dust floated like mist in the shafts of sunlight, and the air carried the scent of old wood and time. He wasn't looking for anything in particular. Something had just pulled him there, a nudge from within, subtle and persistent. In the back corner, beneath an old tarp, he found a box labeled Helen. His hands hesitated before lifting the lid. Inside were small fragments of a life they had built together, scrapbooks, postcards, a pair of her gardening gloves, and an old camera wrapped in a faded scarf. George sat down on a wooden stool, held the camera in his hands, and closed his eyes. It felt like holding a memory. He turned it over and pressed the power switch. To his surprise, the little screen blinked awake. The battery still held a flicker of life. He scrolled through the photos. Landscapes, birthday cakes, their children, a few blurry selfies with Helen's unmistakable grin taking up most of the frame. Then he stopped on one photo. It was taken during a trip to Maine years ago. The two of them stood barefoot on a beach, drenched from unexpected rain, laughing with arms around each other like teenagers. George remembered how cold the water had been, how they danced anyway. That moment hadn't lasted more than a few minutes, and yet here it was, preserved, still warm in his heart. For a long time, George had believed that joy was something you could hold on to if you tried hard enough, that if you loved deeply, if you planned carefully, if you did everything right, the good things might just stay. But they never did. People changed, time moved, health faded, even the sharpness of memory softened. It used to feel like loss. Now he was beginning to see it differently. Helen's laughter, that rain-soaked photo, the way she'd always tuck her hair behind her ear when she was thinking, none of it lasted. And that, he realized, was what made it so precious. If we could live in those moments forever, perhaps they'd lose their brilliance. But they come and go like cherry blossoms in spring, breathtaking precisely because we know they won't stay. George returned the items to the box, but kept the photo. He placed it on the kitchen windowsill, where the morning light would find it. Each time he looked at it, he didn't feel sorrow. He felt something softer, a gratitude for what had been, a peace with the fact that it had ended. Later that week, during one of his walks by the river, he picked up a fallen leaf, still vibrant with early autumn color, and held it between his fingers. He admired its beauty, knowing it would dry and curl soon. But that didn't make it any less lovely. In fact, it made it more so. He thought of Helen, of that beach, of the leaf, and whispered to himself, not with sadness, but with quiet understanding, it was never meant to last. That's why it meant so much. Number 4, finding peace in the noise. It was supposed to be a routine checkup. George had woken early, dressed in his usual layers, pressed flannel shirt, soft wool cardigan, comfortable slacks, and driven himself to the city hospital for a follow-up on his blood pressure. He didn't like hospitals. They made him feel like a number in a system too large to see him clearly. But he went, because that's what Helen would have wanted. "Take care of yourself," she used to say, gently but firmly, the way she said most things. The waiting area was crowded, louder than usual. A child was crying somewhere behind the glass doors. A man was on the phone arguing in a hushed but tense voice, and the overhead announcements called out names that blurred together. George found a seat near the window and tried to focus on the tree swaying outside, its leaves fluttering in the wind. But the noise pressed in. Conversations overlapped, machines beeped. An orderly dropped a tray. His chest tightened slightly, not from illness, but from the sheer weight of being in a place so full of urgency. Then something unexpected. A man, about George's age, came rushing into the lobby, his face pale and drawn. His shirt was untucked, his hair wild. He staggered to the desk, asked for directions, then sat down 2 chairs away from George and put his head in his hands. His shoulders trembled. George didn't need to ask what had happened. He recognized that kind of grief instantly. It had visited him once, too. For a moment, George froze. He didn't know this man. He didn't know what to say, and maybe nothing would have been enough. But still he found himself reaching out, not with words, but with a quiet gesture. He placed a gentle hand on the man's arm, and they sat there, together in the din of the waiting room. No one noticed. No one needed to. There was no fixing, no solving, just presence. It was then that George remembered something Li Mei had once told him by the river. Peace is not the absence of noise. It's the ability to be still within it. He'd nodded politely at the time, unsure what to make of it. But now, in the middle of fluorescent lights and crying children and worried hearts, he understood. The man didn't speak, but after a few minutes, his breathing slowed. He stood, nodded gratefully, and disappeared behind a set of double doors. George sat for a while longer, his hand resting quietly in his lap. The noise didn't fade, but it no longer overwhelmed him. Later, walking back to his car, George didn't feel exhausted the way he usually did after hospital visits. He felt grounded, as though some small weight had lifted. Maybe, he thought, peace isn't something we find when the world gets quiet. Maybe it's something we carry with us, a stillness we learn to protect, even when everything around us is rushing and breaking and uncertain. And maybe, just maybe, we discover it not when we seek it out, but when we offer it to someone else. Number 5, letting go of control. For most of his life, George had clung to structure like a lifeline. He was the kind of man who believed in neat calendars, sharpened pencils, and carefully folded laundry. When he was teaching, his lesson plans were meticulous. When Helen was alive, she would tease him gently for his obsession with control. "George," she'd laugh, "you even organize your sock drawer by color. Life doesn't come with a filing cabinet, you know." But after she was gone, that need to control only deepened. Maybe it was his way of trying to keep things from falling apart. Maybe he thought that if everything on the outside was in order, the chaos inside wouldn't be so loud. He scheduled his days down to the hour. Walks at 9, reading from 10. To 11, lunch at noon, phone calls on Thursdays, grocery trips on Tuesdays. There was a comfort in the routine, but also a quiet fear beneath it. A fear that if he stopped managing everything so tightly, he might be left with nothing but the silence. Then came an unexpected visit. It was a warm spring afternoon when his daughter called, asking if she could drop off her 8-year-old for a few hours. Her sitter had cancelled last minute. George hesitated. It was his quiet day, the one he set aside to clean the house and catch up on his reading. He'd already laid out his to-do list, but something in her voice, half apologetic, half hopeful, made him say yes. When his granddaughter Ellie arrived, she burst through the door with the energy of 1,000 suns. She wanted to bake cookies, play cards, run in the backyard, and show him a dance she'd made up all in the first 10 minutes. His plans disintegrated instantly, the house filled with flour and laughter, sticky hands and off-key singing. She talked through the entire baking process, telling stories about her school, her friends, her favorite colors. And George, he didn't once look at the clock. That evening, after she'd gone home and the house had settled again into its usual quiet, George stood in the kitchen surrounded by crumbs and fingerprints and scattered playing cards, and he smiled. Not just because of the joy she'd brought, but because, for a few precious hours, he had lived outside the grip of control. He hadn't needed to know what came next. He hadn't needed a plan. He had simply been there, fully, with her. Later, as he sat by the river, he remembered something the water had been teaching him all along. That it flows not by force, but by surrender. That it reaches every place it needs to, not by pushing, but by yielding. And he began to wonder what else in his life might find its way if he simply stepped aside and let it. Letting go didn't mean letting life unravel. It meant trusting that even without his tight grasp, things could still unfold, with beauty and grace. And perhaps in that surrender he could finally breathe a little easier. Perhaps he could finally live. Nabri Masu 6. Quiet strength in adversity. The call came on an ordinary Tuesday morning, just after George had finished his toast. It was his doctor, her voice steady and kind, the way doctors speak when they've had to deliver the same news more times than they'd like. The results from his latest eye exam were back, and it was confirmed: macular degeneration. Early stages, but progressive. The kind of diagnosis that doesn't shake the ground all at once, but quietly shifts the horizon line. George sat at the kitchen table long after the call ended. The morning sun streamed through the window, soft and golden, but something inside him dimmed. He thought about the books he might not be able to read someday, the river walks he might no longer see clearly, the photo of Helen on the windowsill, slowly fading not just from time, but from sight. There was a coldness in the realization that the world he had always depended on, its shapes, its colors, its familiar outlines, might begin to blur beyond his reach. For a few days he withdrew. He didn't go to the river. He didn't write in his notebook. He watched television with the sound low and lights off, letting the flicker of the screen dance across his face while his thoughts wandered into quiet corners. He wasn't afraid. Of death, not really. He had come to understand its presence, but losing the ability to see, especially in a life where watching had become his way of being, felt like a slow erasure. Not of life itself, but of how he participated in it. Then, on a morning not much different from the one before, George reached for the small handheld recorder his son had given him years ago. It had been meant for preserving family stories, capturing his voice for the grandchildren. He hadn't used it much. But now, he pressed the record button and spoke. He didn't speak with performance or polish, just honestly. He described a view from his window, the way the light hit the photo frame, the sound of the leaves brushing against the house. He spoke of Helen, of the river, of Ellie's laughter echoing through the kitchen. He told stories, not grand ones, but small, warm ones. In recording what he could see and feel now, he wasn't trying to hold on to the past. He was bearing witness to the present, just as it was. Day by day, this quiet act of speaking became a kind of strength. He didn't deny the fear or the loss, but he no longer let it define the edges of his life. He understood now what Li Mei had meant when she told him the rock in the river didn't resist the current. It simply endured, steady and unmoved, allowing the water to shape it without breaking it. George was still that rock, not untouched by time or softened by sorrow, but firmly planted in the flow of things. And maybe that was enough, not to fight against the tide, but to stand quietly in its midst, grounded in acceptance. In that quiet strength, he found a new kind of peace, not in what he could hold on to, but in what he could release. Number 7, reflecting back, moving forward. The habit began almost by accident. One evening, George sat by his kitchen window as the last bit of light faded across the yard, a mug of lukewarm tea in his hands. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that no longer felt lonely, just familiar. He reached for the worn notebook, the one with the faded inscription he'd found months earlier, and instead of writing, he read back through the pages, slowly, thoughtfully, as though he were sitting across from a dear friend. There, in the ink-stained lines of his own hand, he saw the unfolding of something he hadn't quite realized was happening. Change. It wasn't dramatic. There were no proclamations, no sudden breakthroughs. But as he turned the pages, he noticed the tone had shifted. The early entries were full of questions, grief, aching slowness. But over time, those thoughts gave way to quiet observations, moments of gratitude, small joys. There was an entry about Ellie and the cookie dough in her hair. One about the river's color after rain. Another about the silence he felt while holding the hand of a stranger in the hospital lobby. Without intending to, George had been writing a story of becoming, not in the way people often talk about reinvention, but in the subtler way of remembering how to be present. That night, he wrote again, not to process pain, but to honor peace. He wrote about the tree outside his window and how it seemed to move differently depending on the wind. He wrote about Helen, not with sorrow this time, but with deep affection, as though she were sitting nearby, listening in. He even wrote to himself a few lines that began simply, "You're doing okay. Keep going." Each reflection, each small gesture of stillness, had become a way to trace the shape of his life. Not for anyone else, not for posterity, but to understand that he was still living, still evolving. Even in this quiet chapter. As spring stretched toward summer, George found himself less concerned with how much time he had left and more attuned to the way time moved through him. He no longer needed to ask what the future would bring. He was more interested in what the moment was offering. He still walked to the river, sometimes alone, sometimes meeting Li Mei and sharing stories in companionable silence. He still made tea in the afternoons and listened to Ellie's voicemail messages about her new puppy. The days didn't feel urgent anymore. They felt full. Reflection had not brought him answers. It had brought him closer to the questions in a way that no longer demanded resolution. He had learned to sit with himself, not in judgment, but in recognition. In the end, George understood that moving forward didn't mean leaving things behind. It meant carrying them with more gentleness, more clarity, more grace. His life hadn't been paused after all. It had simply changed shape. And, in learning to see it day by day, he had quietly found his way back to it. As summer drifted gently into the softness of early fall, George found himself waking each morning with a kind of quiet anticipation, not for anything grand or extraordinary, but for the subtle, almost imperceptible moments that had become the rhythm of his days, the golden light pouring through the curtains, the way the breeze carried the scent of leaves just beginning to turn, the sound of the neighbor's dog barking in the distance. There was nothing remarkable about these details, yet they filled his life with a kind of fullness he hadn't known he was missing. One morning, as he sat by the river, his usual spot, the one worn smooth by time and memory, George took out The small notebook again. The same notebook that had found him all those months ago, or perhaps the one he had been meant to find. He flipped back through the pages, lingering on entries written during darker days. He didn't feel sorrow as he read them. He felt a deep tenderness for the man he had been then. The man who had been waiting without knowing that what he truly needed was already unfolding. Everything had changed, though nothing had changed all at once. His days were still quiet. His body still ached in the mornings. The photo of Helen still sat on the windowsill, its corners now slightly curled. But George had changed. He had learned that healing wasn't a straight line, that peace wasn't a destination, but a practice. That reflection wasn't about fixing what had been broken, but about seeing clearly what had always been whole beneath. The cracks. In his later years, George had discovered something many spend a lifetime chasing: how to be still without being stuck. How to let life move through him, like the river he had come to love, without needing to hold or define it. He had stopped asking when things would get better, and instead began asking how he could be more present for what already was. As the sun warmed his back, George smiled, not with the joy of someone who had everything figured out, but with the quiet contentment of someone who no longer needed to. He knew now that everything truly does unfold in its own time. Not always on our schedule, not always in the ways we expect, but always somehow with purpose. And if his story reaches you in this moment, if it finds you in the middle of your own waiting, your own questions, your own slow unfolding, may it remind you that you're not alone, that there is grace in going gently, strength in surrender, and peace waiting quietly beneath the noise. If this journey with George has brought you comfort or reflection, I invite you to stay. Subscribe to this space, where each week we explore the wisdom hidden in ordinary lives, in quiet moments, and in the deep, steady rhythm of letting go. Share your thoughts if you feel moved. Because the beauty of stories like rivers is that they are meant to flow, connecting us, carrying us, reminding us that we are all part of something larger, something unfolding even now.